So the movie that we're going to be talking about tonight is called Fate of a Man, Судьба человека. In Russian, it's by the director Sergei Bonbarchuk. So the big concept that you need to understand the historical time period of this movie is World War II, or as it's called in Russia, the Great Patriotic War. And I feel like we could go through the actual blow by blow history of it, but that's not really as effective for talking about what it means to Russians and why this was so impactful. So this is World War II as a whole is the most destructive conflict in human history. Globally, we see more than 50 million, civilians and soldiers die, and Russia bears the brunt of this burden. The Soviet Union, so Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, the Germans invade in 1941 and inflict absolutely massive losses on every sector of Soviet society. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 27 million Russians die in this war. And to put that in context, the amount of Americans that died in World War II was around 400,000. So not even a 20th of what the Russians suffered in as many years. And to put it in perspective with the total population, that's somewhere between 15 to 20% of the entire Russian population dies in this war, 1 in 5 people almost, which is, it's hard for us to even imagine that number. The reasons why it's so deadly are, many, but part of it is Russia is a huge country involving huge populations fighting. For example, the Battle of Stalingrad, which was the pivotal battle when the Russian or the German invasion of Russia that turned the tide, involved more than 2 million people fighting in that city at some point in the year that it happened. The Germans were using especially harsh tactics on the Russians too. You see stuff like scorched earth, which is when either the army that's retreating out of the land or the army that's advancing in just like burns farmland and deprives the civilians of food. And the purpose of it is to deny another army coming in, the means to supply itself off the land, to get food and, survive without supply lines. But that has a major negative effect on civilian populations. World War II also features a ton of bombing of civilian centers. This is the first war where we really see the differentiation between soldiers that are fighting in the war and civilians who aren't fighting. That differentiation dissolves. So you're seeing a lot of deliberate targeting of civilian populations. And this is bad. Obviously, this has a massive impact on Russian society going forward. Russia doesn't really recover from this loss psychologically in a lot of ways. And I'll get into the longer term impacts of it now. You have a sense of loss felt by nearly everyone. When you lose 20 to 25 million people in a society, 1 in 5 people, every single person or nearly every single person in Russian society is going to know someone who died in this war. The fighting was so massive that you're seeing, the old, the young, the sick sent off to fight. So it's not the normal casualties of just young men. It's fathers, uncles, in some cases, some rare cases, grandfathers, right? The impact is very massive across a very wide age scale, which increases the sense of loss. You have mass conscription too. Like the sheer size of the conflict requires that the Soviet government draft a lot of people who otherwise just wouldn't be in service. So a lot more people than the usual population are feeling it. You also have a very clear enemy in all of this. Like there's no skepticism in the Soviet Union that fighting the Nazis is right. The Nazis are, obviously, there's not that much I need to say about them. They're the Nazis, right? So the Soviet Union, even though it pays this immense price, this war is still something they're ultimately proud of, right? Like they're paying the ultimate price. They're suffering the biggest burden to beat the biggest foe, right? And keep in mind too, that this mindset of we're willing to bear any cost, but once we get going, we can take any sacrifice and we can beat any enemy, that carries into the Cold War, that's carrying into Russian history. And ultimately, this is an immense source of national loss, but also a source of national pride. So there's a lot of mixed emotions around this conflict. To get into the director, Sergei Bonbarchuk, he was born in 1920 in present-day Ukraine, which remember at the time was part of the Soviet Union. He first performed as an actor when he was 16 or 17, so this is the mid-1930s. He originally was an actor on stage, and then he went to theater school for college, so he was in college from 38 to 42. As soon as he left college, he was conscripted to fight in the Soviet army. So he fights from 42 through the end of the war in 45. He's discharged in 1946. Of note, he won the Order of the Patriotic War, second class, which was a Soviet military award for courage in battle. I wasn't able to track down exactly what it's given for, but it's typically for a specific task, like this guy destroyed 3 tanks, or he shot down 2 planes, or he killed 5 people, right? It's something quantifiable, so you have to have proof that it happened to get it, which speaks to the fact that this guy saw action, he got what it was like, he was in there, right? He wasn't sitting at a desk in the back, he saw what he is depicting in his films, which makes a big difference in how they feel and how realistic they are. He goes to a career in film acting after the war, and then he goes to a career in directing and acting at the same time. So he picks up the directing hat too. And this is part of his talent. So in Fate of a Man, the middle picture on this slide is him in this movie. He directed and starred in this movie, which is no easy feat to do, especially when Fate of a Man was the first movie that he ever directed. So he's taking on an immense burden as a young man. The guy's highly ambitious, and he gets extremely good results consistently, right? Domestically, he's recognized for, he becomes the president of the Soviet Union of Cinematographers. He wins the Stalin Prize First Class for his acting. He won the USSR State Prize. He won the Lenin Prize for this movie, and the Hero of Socialist Labor Award later on in his life. He wins these for his roles directing and acting. And I mean, these aren't cheap awards. I'm not exactly sure what the criteria for all of them is, but they're very high order state awards recognizing artistic and, commercial talents. And internationally, he's recognized too. He directed War and Peace, which was a huge international hit in the 60s based on the book. And then he also directed an English language film called Waterloo, which came out in the early 70s, which is just a huge war epic, and that got recognition too. So he got an Academy Award and a Golden Globe for War and Peace, and he was otherwise recognized for his work in international cinema. And he directed until the day he died in 1994. So this is a guy who dedicated his whole life to, filming these stories, filming very intimate human characters. He had 70 years of experience in it. And he was immensely talented because he was directing and acting at the same time, which, just is not easy at all. And now to get into the film itself and how it ties into the theme of the festival tonight. Fate of a Man is all about resistance. I'm not going to spoil anything, but the basic story is Sergei Bonbarchuk plays a father. The early film gets into how he builds his family, and then he's conscripted and he goes off to war. And the rest of it is his struggle to survive, his struggle to find meaning in all of it. His struggle against the Nazis in many different ways, whether in combat or in a prisoner of war camp. And then his struggle to recover from it all. I mean, this is an immensely impactful conflict for him. And he would know, he fought in it. He was there himself. His sense of, his Soviet sense of history around the conflict, as well as his actual wartime experience, influences it a lot. So take, for example, the depiction of the Germans, right? There's no real moral ambiguity about him here. This is a Soviet who fought the Germans talking about the Germans. So they're, the soldiers are sadistic and ravenous. The leaders are gluttonous and greedy and, also sadistic. It's it's contrasted very sharply to the nature of the Soviet soldiers, who are simple, they're honest, they're fighting for their country. They didn't want this war, but they didn't start it, but they're going to finish it. Just like the Soviet Union itself, a massive cost is played by this main character, or is paid by the main character in every sense of the word. There's an unrelenting desire to fight for the country through all of it, though. He's paying this price, but all through the film, he's not convinced that his actions are wrong. He's not regretting it, but he has to find the strength to keep going. So in many ways, this film is a very, very interesting, almost nationalistic depiction of the Soviet Union in World War II, right? This main character who is paying any price, who's undergoing all these burdens, who's, undergoing circumstances that none of us would want to do, all in the service of his country. And he's not questioning it. He's not bitter at the country for it. He's not, protesting against the war or anything. He's bearing them out, and the struggle is within him, right? The struggle isn't him versus the world. The struggle is, how do I find the strength to keep going? And why is this all happening to me, right? But ultimately, he makes it, right? So, ultimately, this is a film that directly concerns one man's resistance. I think the final thing to keep note of, and then I'll wrap it up for Q&A pretty soon, is this is a multi-generational struggle. You're going to see the scale of the war in a lot of ways. For one, you can see in the middle frame, there's just hundreds of extras in this shot. And you're going to see throughout the movie, there's tons of different, tanks and soldiers and planes. And I have a feeling the Soviet government was involved in supplying military, materiel to the film. But this is also illustrating that this war was a really big deal, involving a lot of people over a very wide period of time. And the main character himself, he goes off to war, his son goes off to war, a lot of people he knows go off to war, his hometown is ravaged by the war. This is a total war in every sense of the word. And nonetheless, he finds a way to keep going, which is immensely inspiring. Okay, so here's the, the Great Patriotic War. On the left is a picture of Stalingrad, and on the right is a picture of an artillery crew. That, this isn't super meaningful, it's just for context. Here's the director himself, Sergei Bonbarchuk. On the right, he's a very, very young man. In the middle, this is him in the film. So his directorial debut, but also a really good performance acting. And then on the left, this is him when he's older. And then here is the film itself. So on the left, we have a movie poster for it. And then in the middle, here's a scene just showing like how many extras are in this at times. And then on the right is Bondarchuk in the lead role. He's sitting in a car with another Soviet officer. So with that, I think that's a pretty good primer to it. Thank you all so much.